In the vast sky, where souls travel between life and death, the messenger of fate knelt before the Creator, listening to his command. Go down to the mortal world and bring back the soul of a mother whose time has come. The messenger bowed his head, his white wings trembling slightly in the shimmering light. He had carried out this mission thousands of times. Each time he arrived, took the soul and guided them to the afterlife, without emotion, without hesitation. But this time, when he set foot on earth, he found a small, dilapidated house standing alone in a barren field. Inside, a young mother lay motionless, her skin pale, her final breath long gone. But what made the messenger stop was not the woman's death. It was the 3 little girls surrounding her lifeless body. 3 fragile children. One was still clinging to her mother's chest, her tiny lips searching for warmth that no longer existed. The second wailed uncontrollably, her red eyes filled with sorrow, her tiny hands shaking her mother as if trying to wake her up. The third had cried herself dry, now lying still, her empty eyes staring into nothingness. A cold wind blew through the house, rustling the thin curtain over the window. There was no one else around. Their father had passed away long ago, there were no relatives left to care for them. If he took their mother's soul, what would become of these children? Would they starve? Would they be lost in this world with no one to protect them? The messenger knelt, gently touching the woman's face. She was truly gone. But these children, they were still alive. They needed their mother. They needed a chance to survive. For the first time in his existence, the messenger hesitated. Then he rose, turned away and left, without fulfilling his mission. Back in the celestial realm, the messenger knelt before the Creator. I do not see the soul you were supposed to bring back. Forgive me, my lord, the messenger bowed deeply. But I could not take her. Her 3 children are too young, too fragile. If she leaves, they will not survive. Thunder rumbled across the eternal sky. The Creator's voice darkened. Do you believe you understand fate better than I do? Do you think your compassion can override the laws of the universe? The messenger kept his head lowered, but in his heart, he did not regret his decision. You have made a mistake, the Creator's voice was cold. And you will be punished. I accept my punishment, the messenger replied, his voice unwavering. You will descend to the mortal world and live as a human. You may only return when you have laughed 3 times at your own foolishness. The messenger hesitated. Laughed? He did not feel foolish at all. He believed he had done the right thing. But the Creator's command was absolute. A powerful windstorm engulfed the messenger, pulling him down toward the mortal realm. The light of heaven faded, replaced by the gray sky and the biting cold of human existence. His journey began here. And fate, with its mysterious plans, was already waiting ahead. The messenger awoke in a world unfamiliar to him. The cold wind bit at his skin, and for the first time he felt the discomfort of a human body, hunger, exhaustion, and vulnerability. He was no longer a divine being but just another man, nameless and unknown. He found himself on the outskirts of a small village, where the sky was gray, and the roads were lined with people struggling through life. He had no food, no shelter, and no purpose, only the knowledge that he had to endure until fate revealed its lesson to him. As he wandered the streets, shivering from the cold, his path crossed with that of a cobbler, a simple man with rough hands and a kind heart. The cobbler was returning from the market, his arms full of cloth and supplies. He had saved all his earnings to buy warm clothes for his children, for winter was approaching and the nights were cruel. Then the cobbler saw him. A stranger, barefoot, trembling, his clothes tattered. The cobbler paused, looking at the bundle in his arms, then back at the helpless man before him. A deep sigh escaped his lips. Come with me, the cobbler said, placing a reassuring hand on the stranger's shoulder. You have no food, no warmth. My wife will be angry, but do not worry. Things will settle in time. The messenger followed him, though he did not fully understand why a man with so little would choose to give so much. The moment they stepped into the cobbler's home, his wife's face darkened. Where are the clothes for our children? She demanded, her voice trembling with frustration. I spent the money on him, the cobbler admitted, motioning toward the stranger. He was freezing in the streets. I couldn't leave him to suffer. His wife's eyes filled with anger. Our children will suffer instead, she snapped. You sacrifice their warmth for a man you don't even know? What kind of father are you? The room fell silent except for the crackling fire in the hearth. The messenger watched the woman's anger boil over, saw the pain in the cobbler's tired eyes, and suddenly, he laughed. It was an unexpected, deep, heartfelt laugh. The cobbler turned to him, confused. Why are you laughing? He asked. The messenger only smiled. I will explain once I have laughed 3 times. But inside he had understood something. The cobbler's wife saw only what had been lost: the money, the warm clothes, the comfort of certainty. But she did not see what had been gained. She did not see that by helping a stranger, they had unknowingly welcomed something greater into their home. Though she feared suffering, she could not yet see that kindness is never wasted. Fate does not take without giving in return. And so, the messenger had laughed. Not because the situation was amusing, but because he had begun to glimpse the truth. Human eyes are often too focused on short-term losses to recognize the unseen blessings that follow. This was his first lesson. But fate had more to teach him still. With the cobbler's help, the messenger began to learn the trade. Though he had never done such work before, his hands quickly became remarkably skilled. The shoes he crafted were not only sturdy but also so beautiful that people couldn't take their eyes off them. Soon, the small cobbler's shop became crowded with customers. News of these extraordinary shoes spread far and wide, even reaching the wealthy and powerful. One day, a royal servant arrived at the shop carrying a rare piece of fine leather. He delivered a strict order. Make a pair of shoes for His Majesty the King. But listen carefully, only shoes, never sandals. If you make a mistake, the consequences will be severe. After the servant left, the cobbler turned to the messenger with a serious expression. This is an order from the king. We cannot afford any errors. Be careful, only shoes. The messenger nodded, but as he worked, his hands moved with a will of their own. And when he was finished, he found that he had not made shoes, but sandals. The cobbler's face turned pale with fear. What have you done? He cried. These are not shoes. They're sandals. Do you have any idea how strict the king is? If they find out about this mistake, we won't escape punishment. The messenger looked at the cobbler, who was trembling with worry, and suddenly, he laughed. A deep, knowing laugh. The cobbler stared at him in shock. What are you laughing at? We're about to face disaster. The messenger only smiled. I will explain when I have laughed 3 times. But in his heart he already understood. Not a moment later, the royal servant rushed back in, his face pale, his breath short. Stop making the shoes. Make sandals instead. The king has just passed away. The cobbler was stunned. He stared at the sandals that only moments ago he had believed to be a terrible mistake. Now they were exactly what was needed. Slowly he turned to the strange man beside him. How did you know? He whispered in disbelief. The messenger did not answer. He simply smiled. Because this was the second lesson. People constantly fear the future. They plan, they worry, they try to control what has yet to happen. But in truth, no one knows what tomorrow will bring. Today they think a mistake will ruin everything, but tomorrow that very mistake may turn into salvation. They cling tightly to their expectations, unaware that life is already moving according to its own design. When faced with hardship, we often panic, despair, or rage against fate. But haven't there been times when what we thought was a disaster turned out to be a blessing in disguise? The messenger laughed. Not because anything was funny, but because he had begun to understand. Humans always try to control fate without realizing that fate has already been decided. He had laughed for the second time. But fate still had one last lesson left to teach him. Even though he had laughed twice, the messenger was still not allowed to return to the heavens. A strange feeling stirred within him, a sense of calm mixed with curiosity. The first 2 times he had realized the limitations of human understanding. People only see immediate loss without recognizing the compensation that follows, and they constantly worry about the future despite having no way of predicting it. But there was still one final lesson, one deeper truth that fate wanted him to grasp. Time passed and the cobbler's business flourished. He was no longer a poor craftsman but a master shoemaker whose reputation spread far and wide. People traveled from distant lands just to own a pair of shoes made by his hands. The messenger, still living with him, continued to assist in the workshop. Yet, something within him still felt unresolved. One day, 3 young women entered the shop. They were dressed in elegant garments, their demeanor graceful, their eyes filled with happiness. Walking beside them was an older woman, exuding wealth and kindness. We need to order shoes for our weddings, one of the young women said gently. The messenger looked at them and suddenly his heart trembled. He recognized them. These 3 women were the same 3 infant girls he had once left behind with their dead mother. The same children he had feared would suffer a miserable fate, orphaned and alone. But now they were no longer helpless babies. They were radiant, joyful young women, about to embark on new lives filled with love and promise. The messenger turned to the older woman and asked, "Madam, could you tell me about these young women?" The woman smiled warmly and replied, "They are not my biological daughters. Many years ago, I found 3 infant girls lying beside their deceased mother. No one knew who their parents were. I had lost my own children long ago, and my heart ached with loneliness. So, I decided to take them in and raise them as my own." She looked at the young women with pride in her eyes. They grew up with love, had everything they needed, and received a proper education. And now, fate has blessed them once more. They are about to marry into a royal family. The messenger stood in silent awe. Years ago, he had worried about the future of these 3 children. He had feared that they would be abandoned, left to struggle alone in the world. It was this overwhelming compassion that had driven him to defy his orders and leave their mother's soul behind. But now he saw how misguided his fear had been. Fate never leaves an empty space. When one door closes, another always opens. And at that moment, the messenger laughed. This time it was not a laugh of amusement, nor of irony. It was the laugh of enlightenment. The laugh of someone who had finally seen the whole picture, where before he had only seen fragments. The cobbler, astonished, turned to him. "You're laughing again? This time what for?" The messenger looked at him with serene eyes. "Because at last I understand. I once thought I was wiser than fate, that I knew what was best. But I was wrong. Fate always has a plan even when we cannot see it." He lifted his gaze to the heavens, as if speaking to the very being who had sent him to earth. "I have laughed 3 times. Now I can go home." And right before the cobbler's eyes, the messenger's form began to dissolve into a radiant light. He no longer belonged to this world, for he had completed his lesson. From that day forward, the cobbler no longer feared life's uncertainties. When he suffered loss, he did not despair. When he faced an uncertain future, he did not worry. He understood that every event was part of a greater design, one that human eyes could not perceive but one that could be felt through trust in fate. Because in the end, everything will always fall into place. The cobbler stood in his workshop, staring at the spot where the messenger had just vanished. A strange feeling lingered in the air, something between awe and understanding. He had witnessed a divine being come to earth, struggle with the same doubts that plagued mankind, and ultimately find enlightenment. And now the cobbler found himself changed. For years he had worried about his family, his business, and his future. He had fretted over money, feared hardship, and agonized over choices, believing that his fate was entirely in his hands. But now he realized that there were greater forces at work, forces that humans could neither predict nor control. Life, he finally saw, was like a vast tapestry. Each thread seemed random and chaotic up close, but when viewed from afar, they wove together to create something beautiful and complete. The 3 laughs of the messenger had taught him 3 essential truths. 1. Short-term losses are not true losses. When he had brought the stranger home, his wife had raged at him, thinking they had thrown away their family's security. Yet that very act had brought divine blessings upon them. What seemed like a loss was, in truth, a hidden gain. 2. No one can predict the future. The messenger had unknowingly prepared sandals for a king who was about to die, proving that human plans are always subject to the unknown. No matter how much people worry or prepare, fate will unfold as it is meant to. 3. Fate always has a plan. The triplets whom the messenger had once pitied, had not only survived but thrived. Their path had been paved with unexpected kindness, guiding them toward happiness. Even in the darkest moments, fate had been silently working in their favor. The cobbler smiled to himself. From that day forward he worked with a lighter heart. He still faced hardships, but he no longer let them consume him. When things didn't go his way, he reminded himself that fate was weaving something beyond his understanding. And when life brought blessings, he accepted them with gratitude, knowing they were all part of a grand design. And so, he lived the rest of his life in peace, no longer questioning, no longer fearing, but simply trusting. Because in the end, everything happens for a reason.